We're starting again with gusto. And we are going to start talking now about our 19th president. Very strong lady, amazing personality. When you learn about her now, we are going to hear more about her today. We know that she was such a strong personality into so many activities at a time when India was about to achieve its independence. This was in 1946-47, when I'm talking about Lady Dhanwanthi Rama Rao, who was the 19th president in 1946-47, when India was on the threshold of independence. And many activities were going on in all over the country, not only in the field of women's empowerment or about women and their welfare, but generally the scenario, we were about to get our freedom. And as we all know, we must have seen that amazing flyer, as always, prepared by Supriya. Can I request someone to mute themselves? There's a lot of sound. Yeah, thank you. So Lady Rao was for the social reform movement that was going on at that time. The Sharda Bill saw her support. Then she also supported women's suffrage, the voting rights for women, which were about to be formed when we were talking, because the constitution was being written at this time. She was against, this population thing, and she was into family planning in a big way. This was the time when, people were also opposing family planning, and she pushed it forward. And also, she was against child marriage, also awarded Padma Bhushan for her services in 1959. So before we start talking about her more, because we have an amazing panel lined up today of speakers, I would request our President Sheila ji, Mrs. Sheila Kakade, to speak a few words about the program and the objectives. Sheila ji, over to you.
Yeah, thank you, Yutika ji. Namaskar to all my dear sisters and the guests who have joined in today's webinar, taking us on the virtual journey of All India Women's Conference in the 19th year of our existence, along with the dynamic president, Lady Dhanwanthi Rama Rao, and her team consisting of Vice President Mrs. Urmila Mehta from 15th Road, Khar, Bombay, Mrs. Kulsum Sayani, Rupavila, Kambalail Road, Bombay 26, Srimati Ammu Swaminathan, Chetput, Madras, Anusayabai Kale, Dhantoli, Nagpur, Radha Devi Goenka, Madan Mahal, Akola, and Mausama Begum Hussein Ali Khan, Khairatabad, Hyderabad. These were the vice presidents, and the honorary secretary with her was Indira Maidev. She was from Pune, near Pune Gymkhana. Honorary treasurer was Dr. Mrs. Malinibai B. Suptankar from Malabar Hill, Bombay. Lady Rama Rao was the founder president of Family Planning Association of India. Today we have with us Dr. Neena Puri, international ex-chairperson of IPPF, to throw light on her work with Family Planning Association. Granddaughter Neena Wagle Marks and granddaughter-in-law Mary Jane Wagle of Dhanwanthi ji, who are in US, have been very kind to share their memories with us, and will see the recording of it very soon. Women's Indian Association has also been privileged to have Dhanwanthi Rama Rao Association, and we have Preeta Raj, President RPM branch, to share that. We also have Maithili Jagannathan, Coordinator Shahadra Project, presenting important aspect of our beloved President, and Mrs. Vajra Rao, patron of Mangalore branch, has helped in collecting information and pictures from Mangalore, Karnataka. I welcome all of you to witness the journey virtually. I appreciate the efforts put in by our MIC for communal harmony and peace, Dr. Manju Kak. Thank you very much, Manjuji, for managing to get the interview with Lady Rama Rao's grandchildren. Thank you, each one of you, for your precious contribution, not forgetting our staff. Before moving further, I take this opportunity to offer our gratitude to our President Dhanwanthi Ji Rama Rao Along with Mrs. Avabai Wadia, she gave Mumbai branch and few other branches specially custom-built Skipo medical van to operate for women and children welfare of rural India. The MOU was signed on 14th November 1947 by the President, Lady Rama Rao, and the Skipo Fund was created in London in 1945. Under the concept and guidance of Mrs. Hilda Seligman and Lady Patrick Lawrence and Lady Stafford Cripps for the welfare and upliftment of rural women of India, this project was started, and thus Adivasi project of Mumbai branch was established as Skipo project at Talasari on the borders of Maharashtra and Gujarat. The specially designed mobile health van equipped with a medical doctor and medicines would go to the various sections of the interior villages where Adivasi patients were treated with spot diagnosis and necessary medicines were provided. The van was on road for a long time, providing medical service in the rural area. The project well began, continued uh, continued its activities with additional facilities to the tribals when Srimati Kashibai Mohite family donated land of 3,720 square meters in Talasari for medical clinic center. The name was changed to Rural Community Development Center in 1992, but the project went on, popularly known as RCDC Talasari project. The 73 years oldest and the prestigious project for Mumbai branch, the campus also runs a computer training center, Balwadi, and primary school for the locals. We are really grateful to Dhanwanthi Ramarauji for initiating this project, and we are still continuing it at Mumbai branch after 73 years also. Thank you. Now I ask Yutika ji, our member in charge for library, to go ahead with our further program.
Thank you, Sheila ji. Thank you so much for enlightening us about all the activities and the Skippo and the Skippo project, about which I am sure so many of us didn't know. Now we proceed with our program. Moving forward, I would like to invite our first speaker, Mrs. Preetha Raj. She's joined from London. She's going to set the stage for us for this about the life of Lady Dhanwanthi Rama Rao in the Madras Presidency. Chennai at that time was known as the Madras Presidency. Mrs. Preetha Raj is an MA, MSc, MBA, and is Deputy Director of State Government Audit and is the founder president of RPM Women's Welfare Association. I would invite Mrs. Preetha Raj to start her presentation. Preetha ji.
Yeah. Thank you, Yutika ji.
Can you see the screen?
Yes. Yeah, I can, Supriya ji. Yeah, it's there.
Yeah.
So, good afternoon, Mrs. Sheila Kakde ji, President AWC, Mrs. Padma Venkatraman, President WIA, and all other dignitaries present here today. I'm extremely privileged to be here on behalf of WIA and to present the early life of Lady Dhanwanthi Rama Rao, the 19th President of AWC. I will be having a short clipping about her schooling, university education, teaching profession, and about the stage setting for her social work. So we have on screen Lady Dhanwanthi Rama Rao, 19th President of AWC. So next one. So we move on to her early life and education. Dhanwanthi Rama Rao, the 19th President of All India Women's Conference, was born on May 10th, 1893 in Hubli. Now it is in Karnataka, India, as Dhanwanthi Handu to a family of 9 children in a Kashmiri Brahmin household. Her father was Rup Krishna Handu, a railway officer, and her mother was Bagbari Handu. The mother Bagbari made sure that her daughters also received an education. So, Dhanwanthi finished her schooling in Hubli, Karnataka. Next one. Yeah. After her schooling, Dhanwanthi moved to Madras, which was a place that offered good higher education in those days. She graduated in 1917 with an honors degree and the Griggs Gold Medal in English from the Madras Presidency College, becoming one of the first Indian women to attend college. I put a slide on this, the college, how it looks, the Presidency College. On the sides, you can see the Presidency College and the Queen Mary's College, Madras, where she went on to teach. She started her career as an assistant professor in English and became one of the first Indian women to teach higher education at Queen Mary's College, Madras, from 1917 to 1921. And you know, this is a time when gender roles strictly prohibited women from going or doing all these teaching. It was meant only for the male members. She later married Sir Benegal Ramarao, and details of her marriage will be covered by our next speaker. Next slide. Yeah. So from now on, it's the setting the stage for her social work. She was one of the first feminists in Madras. And we'll just see about the influence of women's organizations of the early 20th century in South India. In view of the fact that the social reform movement of the 19th century could not transcend the constraints imposed by the patriarchal norms of the society, and women were continued to be treated as mere objects on whom judgment was to be passed, urgent need was felt for writing a new script which would impart strength to the process in a great nation and reflect its new social, cultural, and political aspirations. Women's question had therefore to be properly dealt with in the reconstruction of historical consciences and search for the golden age. The growing awareness among women in regard to their low position in the male-dominated patriarchal society at different levels motivated them to fight for their rights. By the end of the 19th century, many women representing the elite classes began to form their own organizations. This marked the emergence of a rudimentary women's movement in India. So, the first major attempt to organize women on all India basis took place with the establishment of Women's Indian Association in 1917. And Annie Besant, Margaret Cousins, and Dorothy Jeanarajadasa were the founding members of this organization. Women's organizations, particularly the WIA, served as a powerful medium through which women's opinion on various issues could be freely expressed. They went a long way in the development of women's personalities in such a manner that they could gain the necessary confidence to take up leading roles in politics and social institutions. I am proud to state that I am one of the members of WIA now. So, Dhanwanthi's connections with WIA, as I see from Wikipedia, it says that Dhanwanthi was also one of the co-founders of Women's Indian Association. The other co-founding members being Ambujammal, Kamala Devi Chattopadhyaya, Mary Poonan Tukos, Begum Hasrat Mohani, Sarlabai Naik, Muthulakshmi Reddy, Mangalammal Sadasivaya, and Hirabai Tata. So Dhanwanthi, it seems that she was influenced by all the Muthulakshmi Reddy and all these people who have been the founders of Women's Indian Association. So, and more about Lady Dhanwanthi Ramarao is being shared by next speakers, who will go on to her marriage and her social work and awards and all. I just have a slide here on the book she has written. It's called An Inheritance. It's the autobiography of Lady Dhanwanthi. In her autobiography, The Memoirs of Dhanwanthi Rama Rao, she describes her work for organizations campaigning for Indian independence, which took her throughout Britain, as well as for a variety of women's organizations. In 1932, with a group of Indian women based in London at the time, including Sarojini Naidu, she attended the International Alliance of Women for Suffrage and Equal Citizenship in Berlin, leading the Indian delegation at the behest of Naidu. She continued to work for the Alliance and writes in her memoirs that the meetings gave her first-hand experience of dealing with international work for women's rights. She was awarded the Kaiser-i-Hind Gold Medal by the British government for her work with Women's Association. And I thank you all for listening to my small presentation. And I'm thankful to Mrs. Padmaji and Shivaji for giving me this opportunity. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Pritaji. Thank you so much for telling us about the WIA and the Lady Rao's connections with the other organizations and her early education. It was so interesting. Now we move on with the program, and I would now like to call the next speaker, Mrs. Maithili Jagannathan. Are you there, Maithili ji? Maithili, can we see her?
Yes.
Yeah,
Hello.
she is there.
Yeah, hello.
Yeah.
Just
Okay.
starting. Thank you.
So she's going to talk about the early life and the arranged marriage that Dhanwanthi ji had. You know, it would be interesting for all of us to hear that. And looking forward. Mrs. Maithili Jagannathan is one of our senior members and is a retired civil servant. Presently, she is the coordinator of the Ordinary Women's Conference, Shahadra Krech. And in her presentation, she has been helped by Mrs. Vanaja Rao, who is a senior member and president of the Bangalore branch. So we are all ears, Maithili ji, with your sweet voice. Please start.
Please unmute yourself.
Yes.
Hello, friends. I'm happy to tell you something about Lady Dhanwanthi's husband, Sri Benigal Rama Rao. And he belonged to the Saraswat Brahmin community. So it would be nice to know a little more about this community. Why they were called Saraswat? Because they are said to have originally been in the Saraswati River Valley, somewhere in Kashmir. I have a map of the place. Oh, it's not coming. So it shows that the Saraswati River was somewhere a little above the Indus River, not in the valley of Kashmir, but in the mountainous region of Kashmir. So there these people were living. They were very learned pandits. They were mentioned in the Vedas, in Mahabharata and Ramayana as very good physicians, Ayurveds and Sanskrit scholars. So what happened, what is likely to have happened is that the river dried up due to geological changes and the families had to migrate.
Mrs. Manjula Ghosh, please stop sharing your screen. Mrs. Manjula Ghosh,
So
kindly
and
stop sharing.
they migrated southwards. Some went to the east, to Tirhut and to Kashi. Others came down westward to Dwarka. Manjula naam koi hai.
Just 1 minute, Maithili ji. Will you stop?
Okay.
Please,
One
one second. She has to stop
okay.
sharing her screen. Manjula ji.
Who is Manjula? Calcutta.
Supriya, at your end.
Manjula ji, can you stop sharing your screen?
इसीलिए चलने
नहीं चलेगा ना, पीपीटी नहीं आ रही है
तो वो ऐसा
और एक है ना, हाँ ये बना रहे हैं अच्छा इसको बना देते वो लड़का खड़ा था आपने कुछ किया था क्या?
you need to call her.
Yeah, call her, I think.
Maithili,
Smita
sorry,
Palit,
sorry for
can
this
you tell
interruption.
us, Smita Palit, can you tell Manjula ji to stop share the screen?
Yeah.
Huh?
हाँ पीपीटी का
Yeah, please tell Manjula ji.
Yes.
एक मिनट रहना है.
Now I think you can start.
Okay.
Yeah.
Ah,
Yes.
okay. So this is the Kashmir origin of the Saraswat, the Saraswati River. We can see there right above the Indus, somewhere in the mountainous region in lower Kashmir. So they are said to have migrated when the river dried up. So they came down to, they went to Kashi, they went to Tiruput in the east, they went to Dwarka, then they came down to the western coast of India, and they came to Goa, to the villages of Goa, where many of them settled down. This is one of the oldest temples of Shanta Durga. This is the patron deity of the Saraswats. This was originally an 8th century temple, but it was destroyed by the Portuguese in the 16th century and has been rebuilt again. So this is one of the very sacred temples, Shanta Durga temple. This is an architecture of an old Saraswat mutt at Keloshi, Goa. I thought this is a very interesting photograph of the way the community adapted. You can hardly tell that they were from Kashmir. These are Saraswat Brahmins in Goa in the 16th century. Probably a Portuguese artist has made the painting. So this shows how well they adapted to the new changes, to whatever they had come from, and they maintained their learning and their community life and all that. And these Brahmins were very much in demand in the South Indian kingdoms. There were very big kingdoms of South India like Hoysala, Rashtrakuta, Vijayanagaram. There were the Chora, Shera, and Pandya kingdoms. So everywhere they were welcomed as scholars. They became the priests, they became acharyas. They held the posts of finance minister, they did administration. So they settled in many different places. Now, what happened next? That is the Saraswat Brahmins. ये बात है. Their life was rudely interrupted. The Portuguese took over Goa and the coastal region, including Bombay. इसमें वो शेर याद आती है. वो दौर भी देखे हैं तारीख की आंखों ने, लम्हों ने खता की है, सदियों ने सदा पाई. लम्हों में थोड़े ही दिन में ये अपने खो गए, आजादी खो दी और पोर्चुगल के इसमें आ गए, कब्जे में आ गए. तो क्या हुआ कि वहां जैसे होता था उस जमाने में, सिपाहियों ने लूटपाट किया, फिर बंदूक की तलवार की नोक पर धर्म परिवर्तन हुआ और सब माल सब कुछ हो गया, मंदिरें टूटे, सब टूट गए. तो सदियों तक इस तरह का रहा और ये सब वहां से थोड़े थोड़े करके चल पड़े गोवा को छोड़ के. फिर आ गए नॉर्दर्न कर्नाटका में, कुछ लोग रहे, कुछ आंध्रा गए होंगे, कुछ केरला तक नीचे आ गए साउथ में. और जहां भी गए जिस तरह वो अडेप्ट करते थे, वहां अपनी जो कोंकणी और तुलु भाषा थी उसके साथ कन्नड़ा या मलयालम या तेलुगु ये सब जोड़ दिए मिलके, फिर वहां अपना जीवन शुरू कर दिए. तो ये बड़ी इंटरेस्टिंग कम्युनिटी है, इसीलिए आपको ये स्टोरी सुना रही हूँ. अब जो बेनिगल रामाराव से शादी हुई थी दमयंती जी 1921 में. अब ये दोनों थे सारस्वत ब्राह्मण ओरिजिन के थे और दोनों कन्नड़ अच्छा बोलते थे. दोनों ने प्रेसिडेंसी कॉलेज से पास किया था. और क्या बातें इनमें कॉमन थी, इनकी फैमिली के बारे में थोड़ा पता कर लेते. इस फोटोग्राफ में ये चारों भाई हैं. पहले बता दूं कि इनके जो फादर थे, बेनेगल रामाराव के फादर थे डॉक्टर राघवेंद्र राव। उस जमाने में अंग्रेजी की पढ़ाई शुरू हुई थी साउथ इंडिया में, इंग्लिश वो स्कूल और कॉलेजेस सब शुरू हो गए थे। तो ये जो सारस्वत ब्राह्मण थे वो बड़े एंटरप्राइजिंग थे, एजुकेटेड थे, तो तुरंत वो उन्होंने उसका फायदा उठाया और मेडिकल भी किए, हर प्रोफेशन में, गवर्नमेंट सर्विस में सब में चले गए थे। डॉक्टर राघवेंद्र राव इंग्लैंड में जाके अपनी मेडिकल डिग्री लिए थे और इंडिया में आके मैंगलोर में बहुत बड़े लीडिंग डॉक्टर बन गए थे। उनके ये चारों बेटे हैं। पहला लेफ्ट में देखिए, फोटो थोड़ा कटा हुआ है, बहुत पुराना फोटो है, सीरीज किताब से फोटो लिया गया है। ये नरसिंह राव थे, जो वो भी सिविल सर्वेंट थे, फिर बड़े जूरिस्ट थे और यूनाइटेड नेशन सिक्योरिटी काउंसिल में इंडिया की तरफ से हमारे रिप्रेजेंटेटिव थे। कॉन्स्टिट्यूशन का इन्होंने बहुत बड़ा हिस्सा इन्होंने ड्राफ्ट किया था, बहुत बड़ा योगदान था इनका कॉन्स्टिट्यूशन में। द सेकंड ब्रदर is Shri Sanjeev Rao. He was in the Theosophical Society of Bangalore. He was a founder. He worked very hard for the society, but he died very early. So third is Benegal Narsingh Rao, the hero of our story. And he also passed the ICS in 1919. And he had gone to Oxford for his higher studies. He also had a very distinguished career. After being a High Commissioner in London, he was posted as ambassador to the US. And after that, for a long, long time, he was the governor of Reserve Bank of India. So he had a very distinguished record to his credit. The last son, who is Shiva Rao, was a leading journalist of the time. He became a member of parliament and for several years he was in the Lok Sabha. So this is the family background and this is the photograph. We can see Dhanwanthi ji second from the right. This is a very faint photograph, very hard to distinguish people. But this shows the entire family, sons and brides of the family. And in the center is Dr. Raghavendra Rao. By his side is his wife, Radha Bai. So this is the family photo. And in this way, the family continued the tradition, the Saraswat heritage continued with adaptability and scholarship, contributing to the life of the nation. Thank you. I want to thank Vajra Narayan Rao, who was former president of Mangalore branch. She has been so kind. She has gone to the village Benegal. She has found old photographs and sent them to us, all for this webinar of AWC. Thank you, Vajraji.
Thank you, Mathili ji. That was so interesting how the North and South meet, you know. I didn't know, frankly, I also didn't know that the Saraswats traveled all the way down and settled there because of certain reasons. Thank you so much, Rielana. Can you stop presenting now? Stop sharing your screen, Mathili ji? Can you, so that I can call the next speaker? And so we are all ears now for the next speaker, our very own Dr. Manju Kak. She needs no introduction for all of us, but since it's a formality, I would like to introduce her, Dr. Manju Kak. She's going to talk about the life and work of Lady Dhanwanthi Rama Rao, to whom I think she's also related. I think she'll tell us herself about that. And she's the ex-treasurer of AIWC and currently a member in charge of Communal Harmony and Peace, and is the executive vice president of International Alliance for Women. She has worked as a professor, teacher, artist, curator, and has had several exhibitions on art and socio-cultural subjects. She has authored several books and has been a TV commentator. And the amount of awards and fellowships that she has had is amazing. And I have a list here. I would like everyone to know that. and she has given international lectures in several places. She has been awarded the Katha Award, the Hawthornden Fellowship, the Charles Wallace British Council Fellowship, the Breadloaf Fellowship, and has had the Senior Fellowship from the Ministry of Culture, and so on and so forth. It's a long list, but she herself had told me that don't go on with the introductions, cut them short. Okay, Manjuji? So I'm cutting the introduction short. Over to you for your presentation.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Yutika. I would just like to first tell everybody that I want to divide my presentation into two parts. First of all, I would like to bring Dhanwanthi Rama Rao to life through memory and through my own personal observations. And secondly, I would like to give you a PowerPoint presentation on her work and her biography. So first of all, let me just bring her to life. Dhanwanthi Rama Rao was a Kashmiri Brahman, a Saraswat Brahmin, as mentioned by Maithili. And being a Saraswat Brahmin, she married Rama Rao, who was also a Saraswat Brahmin, and it was an arranged marriage. But it is important to understand what she was born, who she became, and how she developed, and how we, her younger generation, perceived her. My earliest memories of her are with her fabulous South Indian silk Kanjivaram saris. She would wear these bright colors, and in the north, it was something unique for us. And she would wear these blue diamonds in her ears, the Madras diamond, bade bade. And hum log chote the, hum sochte the ki, you know, she was like a hoor ki pari who would come for family weddings and things like that. And I have some saris because every wedding in our family, the request would go to Dhanwanthi Nani to send the saris. And there they were in big piles coming from the weaver. For every wedding, her Kanjivaram saris would be selected by her and sent by her. And those days, the new fashion had started to wear diamond earrings, and the best diamonds were in Madras. And therefore, Dhanwanthi Nani would be told to do these things. Why am I mentioning this? Because I wanted to say she was first of all a woman, and a woman of the family. It isn't that all her work and her engagements with her husband, who was in the official circles, took her away from her family interests. She was a part of everyone's life. She took time to write long letters to everyone, whether they were graduating, whether they were in school, agar kisi ki yahan koi maut ho gayi, or somebody was getting engaged, and she would write advice in those inland letter forms of those days, not postcards, inland letters, in which the first page would be about wishing people well, and the second page would be about giving advice. And her advice would always be, invest in education, invest in education. If you're educated, you are rich. If you're not educated, you're not rich. She was a very stylish woman, and I don't know how many members will approve, but once she lived in England, she used to smoke, and she always had a cigarette in her mouth, but not straight. She had it with a silver cigarette holder. Or hum chote chote the, we would get very shocked. Who is this woman wearing a sari with a big brooch and her hair done nicely? It is only later we realized that this persona of stylishness, of fashion, of understanding, hid a very, very serious person who felt and thought very deeply about the country and about the affairs of the world, and whose contribution was larger than life. My mother unfortunately lost her mother when she was very young. So she was brought up in Chennai with her Masi, that was Dhanwanthi Rama Rao, and through her imbibed a lot of the qualities that I'm going to discuss. So having given you a small picture, a vignette of who Dhanwanthi Rama Rao was, let me go to the prepared PPT. Supriya, can we start the presentation, please? The first one.
Ritu is doing it. Yeah, Ritu,
Yes.
please.
Lady Dhanwanthi Rama Rao, the 19th President of All India Women's Conference, 1946, Akola, Berar. The second presentation is a very beautiful portrait of hers, which shows her in her gentle avatar with her typical brooch, which she always had on her sari. Let's go to the third slide, Ritu. Yeah. Lady Dhanwanthi Rama Rao, 1893 to 1987, patron and past president of AIWC. She entered public life in her early 20s and took an active part in campaigns for education, health, emancipation, and progress of Indian women. She was a pioneer in the field of family planning, deeply influenced by Dr. Muthu Lakshmi Reddy, Margaret Cousins, Annie Besant, some of the early feminists role models in Madras, Chennai, where she was educated. The next slide. Her association with the IWC went back to the early 20th century at its inception. Inevitably, the organization had become closely allied with Gandhiji's call for freedom from colonial rule. In the historic year 1946 to 47, history was made and she became the president of All India Women's Conference. She was very well aware of the challenges at this juncture. A modern independent nation was born, but the baggage of the old had to be shed, and a new democratic architecture built over the crumbling feudal one. It was, in her words, a half freedom only. Now, at this point, I would like to mention that she lived in Chennai, and Chennai at that time was deeply influenced by the Theosophical Society. Annie Besant, the Irish woman, had come to Adyar, and along with the other leading members like Colonel Olcott and others, she had established this thinking in the Theosophical Society to influence a lot of the Indians there. Just remember, in those days, we all were taught the colonial mindset was there, and everybody felt that if it wasn't British or if it wasn't Western, it wasn't good. But the Theosophical Society played a historic role in our country by bringing to everyone the understanding in India that the soul of India lay in her past, the soul of India lay in her own religious texts, in her philosophy, in her culture and understanding. And the Theosophical Society and the people who were drawn to the society, like as just now Maithili mentioned, Dr. Sanjeeva Rama Rao and his wife Padmavati, these were people who were a close-knit community who spread the ideas of go back to your roots, go back to ancient India, go back to your strength, and bring from that strength the understanding. This was so important to us because the beginnings of freedom had started. After the partition of Bengal in 1905, the first ripplings of discontent had spread to the country. You had Sri Aurobindo raising the flag, and you had others like Tilak and Lajpat Rai and others who raised the slogan of getting rid of the British. That was the time in India when there was a sense of extremism, where there was a sense of fighting with violence. This is pre-Mahatma Gandhi years. And there was a strong wind of freedom. At that time, there was a consciousness, and Dhanwanthi was just entering Presidency College. It was 1909, when the partition of Bengal, and 1908, when Bal Gangadhar Tilak had said Swaraj and had raised the souling of Purna Swaraj, that is complete Swaraj. Much later, in 1916, there would be the Lucknow Congress, and there would be discussion on what kind of freedom. But when Annie Besant, who had started this and who had influenced people in Adyar to think about their own culture, and she became the president of the 18 or 19 Congress, and she had asked for home rule. These were the kind of thoughts that were swirling around Chennai, swirling around the Madras presidency, and young educated women like Dhanwanthi could not help but become passionately involved in those thoughts. So the Theosophical Society, while it dealt with philosophy and talked about the ancient Indian understanding of our scriptures, was also the momentum through which we gained consciousness of breaking the shackles, breaking the chains of our colonial masters and understanding who we really were and taking great pride in our Indian heritage. So this was the importance. Naturally, when Dhanwanthi became president at that crucial stage of 1946-47 and a new country was being born, she came to that post with a huge consciousness of not just the great happiness of being liberated and becoming free, but also with the great diffidence and nervousness and anxiety and the burden that it was a half freedom. आधा हमें मिला था, वहां अपना सपना पूरा हुआ था, मगर पूरा सपना करने के लिए there was a long road ahead, and if women did not participate shoulder to shoulder with men, that full freedom would never be won for India. And that was what consciousness she brought. She said in the very beginning in her speech, with the formation of the national governments in our provinces early this year, a confidence was inspired in our people and an expectancy engendered that the much discussed post-war planning through the long war years would now have to take shape. It filled our hearts with pride to see so many women in our new legislatures, women who had made their mark in the women's organization years ago and of whom were immediately called to high office. Our unanimously expressed desire to see our country free and self-governed had been fulfilled, although complete freedom had yet to be attained, and the goals ahead of us were huge and had to be surmounted. And it is therefore with much diffidence that I accept the presidentship of this great organization, All India Women's Conference, in this momentous year of India's history. So this is the kind of feeling she had, and this is the kind of responsibility and baggage she carried when she became the president of All India Women's Conference. But more than that, there was another terrible wind of communal hatred that had swept the country. Itni partition had taken place with such bloodshed that it was always something that made us feel that we had won freedom, but at what cost? And that is something that instead of rejoicing, celebrating, the women of All India Conference under her leadership got together and formed women's committees all over. And their first job was communal harmony and peace, national integration. This was a kind of a fervor that they carried in corners wherever they had opened their centers and wherever there were branches. They were given one mandate, one mission, and that was keep your country safe, keep your country integral, keep your country away from communal harmony. Peace is our mantra, and peace is what we will have to ensure. So she said, recently we have suffered agony and humiliation at the outbreak of communal strife in the country. We have witnessed cruel atrocities on women and children, forced conversion and marriages under compulsion. Our duty demands we too play our part in relief and rehabilitation work. Let our branches form women's committees in cooperation with the representatives of all communities to bring about happier relations between groups and help restore brotherly love. We as an organization voted for non-violence at a time when the Great World War II was being waged. We were then condemned as unpractical in our outlook. But in spite of that, we stood by the principle of non-violence. So the large shadow of Gandhiji and the fact that even though there was a world war raging, he said India will win her freedom through non-violence was so strong that the women of the All India Women's Conference could not but feel that they had to fight shoulder to shoulder to see that the refugees were rehabilitated, to see everyone got clothes, to see that the women were not, there was no violence against them, to see the refugee camps had enough water and food and light. And this was a mission that Dhanwanthi Rama Rao, along with all her partners and her team, took as their mantra. As today, under the presidency of our current leaders, who are, of course, Sheila, Kuljit, and Rehana, we too have understood that at this point in our country, in COVID times, that we must spread the mission of peace and communal harmony, and which we have been doing, thanks to the cooperation of everyone. But we have learned from people like her, we have learned from our presidents who showed us that we cannot keep away from the national stream. We cannot keep ourselves away from what the situation demands. And that is how the All India Women's Conference grew, and the members became committed to the ideals of trying to serve the nation. But how did the story begin? Let me just take you back a little bit to her past. Can you see a photograph of her mother? That is her mother, who was Bhagbari Shah. She was actually given the title Shah because her father was a poet in the Mughal courts, and he had read a poem which pleased the emperor so much that he had given him the title of Shah. Now, Dhanwanthi was born into this family as Dhanwanthi Handu in 1893. She was one of 9 surviving children of 4 girls and 5 boys. Her father, Roop Krishan Handu, was a railway official and came from Delhi. Her mother was Bhagbari Shah. She was born and brought up in the railway colony at Hubli, Karnataka, and was therefore conversant with Kannada. But the colony was populated by mostly Goans and Anglo-Indians, with a church and a Catholic school nearby. The times were such in Hubli at that point. It was a colony, or literally a small town, which was dominated by this railway colony. And Dhanwanthi writes in her book, as well as in her memoirs, that they felt very out of place because they were initially very conservative, patriarchal family, where लड़कियां जो थीं वो घर का काम करती थीं, खाना बनाती थीं, और नीचे जमीन पे they would sit on the floor and eat their food. But all their neighbors were very westernized and they lived differently. So very slowly, her mother, who knew not a word of English, she decided that she had to make her children, her daughters especially, educated. And these daughters must learn to adapt to whichever surrounding. As Maitli said, they were an adaptable community. It's very interesting. Her father actually was a very pampered son of his parents living in Old Delhi. But one day they wanted to go to Ajmer for a wedding. And his wife, who was all of 13 years old, and he was probably 15 or 16, felt that this would be a really nice holiday. So they ordered the buggy. उस जमाने में घोड़ा गाड़ी होती थी, and they ordered the buggy to take them to Ajmer for the wedding. But like typical patriarchal families, the mother was a possessive and probably sometimes a tyrannical woman. And when she saw the last minute that her son and his wife are going away for a few days for a holiday to attend a wedding, she changed her mind. And she said, no, you cannot go. If you go, then don't come back. And according to tradition, all your possessions become mine because you are minors. So until you become a major, you cannot take anything from this house. She didn't realize. She thought she was just threatening them. She didn't realize that her son was so headstrong. And he said, okay. And he left with his wife for this family wedding in Ajmer. And he never came back. He joined the railways in Ajmer. And that's how he left North India to go to the South. It's an interesting story because he made good. And it became quite a legend in the community that one young man had taken this action and reached as far south as Chennai to make a living, far away from his family, because he had so much courage to defend his wife. What did he say to his mother? My wife, not your servant. My wife is my wife, and she deserves a holiday and she deserves dignity. So that was one example of a man standing up for a woman in those ancient times. Her father, that is Roop Krishna Handu, was a very progressive man, well conversant in English, was enterprising enough to seek employment far away from his paternal home in Delhi. He soon rose up the ladder of the South Maratha Railway and encouraged education of his sons in English. But it was really her mother, Bhagbari, who took the step of allowing her girls to study at the Catholic St. Mary's School on the persuasion of a very gentle Roman Catholic father called Father de Souza, who would often visit their home. And that is how Dhanwanthi was able to finish her matriculation, though she had to take a long journey by train to Mumbai or Bombay to write her exams. Her mother was a traditional housewife. In her autobiography, she writes that she taught her prudence, honesty, hard work, and gave her a great love of education. Though, as I said, she herself did not know a word of English. She couldn't read and write. All she knew was her own language, but she was not literate. This is a picture of her that is being shown. Can you show, Ritu, the next slide? And there is the whole family picture. No, above that, the whole family picture, her parents in Hubli in 1895, and she is one of them on the right. The next picture that we have in the slide is of Dhanwanthi herself, but as a young college student at the age of 17. Dhanwanthi's father was then offered a post in Madras, and so her family moved. They found a house in Perambur. This is because the South Maratha Railway had purchased the Madras Railway. And so there was an amalgamation, both railways joined together. So her father was giving her promotion and sent to Madras. They found a house in Perambur, and after much persuasion and support of her brother Bali, she was allowed to join the co-educational presidency college in 1909. And in doing so, broke the gender typecasting of a generation. Once the floodgate of education had opened, she forged ahead to complete her MA Honours in 1917 and was awarded the Griggs Gold Medal. Meanwhile, 3 of her brothers left for Edinburgh University to study law and medicine. Her closest brother, Bali, died later in the flu epidemic of 1918 in Sheffield, in England, while doing his medical residency. It affected Dhanwanthi adversely. She joined a teacher's training course, but soon was appointed as a professor of English, assistant professor at the Queen Mary College on Marine Drive, becoming the first woman to teach, one of the first women to teach a higher education. So there is the next slide, Ritu, can you show that? Which shows the full roster of women students at Presidency College in Madras in 1909. Ritu, can you show the next slide, please? Ritu, can you show the next slide, please? Ritu? Hello? Yes. The next slide shows the women of Presidency College in 1909. There were 700 men students and just about 30 or 33 women students. So you can imagine what a very, very bold step her mother took. Because at that time, she writes that everyone was worried that if the girl went to Presidency College, uski shadi nahi hogi. Nobody will marry her after that, because they will say this girl is too forward, too fast. She is not going to be adaptable to any arranged marriage. And in those days, in 1910, foremost in a mother's mind was marriage of her daughter. So this was such a bold step that her mother took, knowing very well that after this, an arranged marriage might become more and more difficult for a daughter. But as I said, her commitment to education was very strong. In Madras, she had an arranged marriage with the distinguished economist and diplomat Sir Benegal Rama Rao, the ICS, a Chitrapur Saraswat Brahmin like herself, and the son of a well-known surgeon from Mangalore. It caused quite a sensation among the conservative Kashmiri Brahmins of the north and divided the community into 2 sabhas. The sabhas were Bishan Sabha and Dharam Sabha. They were for and against marriage out of the community. Vijay Lakshmi Pandit too had an arranged marriage to a Maharashtrian Saraswat, Ranjit, and the times were such that there were many critical articles written about this in the community newspaper. At that time, if you went to a wedding and Dhanwanthi Rama Rao or Vijay Lakshmi Pandit was sitting on a table to eat their food, everybody from the community would get up and walk away and go and sit somewhere else, because it was considered such a scandal and they were considered achut. My own grandfather came down to Chennai and took my mother away from the family because he said that she would be polluted by people like her Masi, that is Dhanwanthi, because these ideas of women getting educated were considered so revolutionary. Next slide, Ritu. My husband and I, that is shortly after our wedding. The next slide shows her as a typical mother nurturing her eldest born. They were posted to Masulipatam in the Madras presidency. And she had a very interesting anecdote in which her husband's major domo was called Francis. And when she went to Madras as the wife of the district collector, Francis would not let her do anything. She herself was quite startled because the food was all Anglo-Indian, English food, and she didn't know that. And she was used to sitting on the floor, on not the floor, on a low stool and eating her food. But her husband told her that no, we are in the residence of the district magistrate. We have to live like Englishmen. And so she had to adapt. Francis would not let her order the food or do anything. So she first showed her first act of rebellion when she told her husband, you get rid of him. If I'm the woman of the house, I will decide the menu and I will decide what is to be eaten. And she said from then she started to learn how to cook English food and puddings and other things, because they had to give dinner parties for all these people who were English, and she had to present these things, and she learnt everything. That she said, just because I was an emancipated, educated woman who had been a teacher and a lecturer, it did not mean that I should neglect my duties towards my husband and his career and his family. Dhanwanthi and Benegal Rama Rao had two daughters. They spent 10 years in England from 29 to 38, when Rama Rao was financial advisor to the Simon Commission and the roundtable conferences that followed. Here the girls went to English private schools. Their experience was not always happy, for racism reared its ugly head, and they were conscious of being from a colonized country. In her autobiography, An Inheritance, she mentions many incidences. One of them is when they went to a theater and they were going to watch an opera. They had very nice seats in the box, but when they sat in the box, no one came and sat next to them, as if they were untouchable. She said, my daughters grew up realizing that they had to learn to adapt to such circumstances. But as a result of all this, there was a fierce patriotism in her, and she decided that she had to do whatever she could to help the freedom movement, and joined the All India Women's Conference during this juncture when it was born in 1927. She was one of the people who became very closely associated, because such experiences taught her that India must become free. The older daughter, Premila, married Nitya Wagle, who was also an ICS officer from a Maharashtrian family with similar family values. He'd studied in Annie Besant School in Banaras. Later, Premila became the first woman garment exporters, while Nitya, the chairman of Crompton Greaves, was awarded a Padma Shri. Her second daughter, Santa Rama Rao, actually her name is Vasanti Rama Rao, married an American academic, became a famous writer and journalist in New York, and the first South Asian woman to be published in America. Dhanwanthi was the representative of All India Women's Conference in London from 29 to 35. She was active in the Indian Women's Association, widely traveled over Western Europe, lecturing on Indian women and their awakening. This experience was reflected later. We have maintained connection with international women's organizations, invited foreign visitors, and welcomed them in our midst, sent our representatives to foreign countries to share in international conferences. She was a fervent believer that women must also be ambassadors of their country and create people-to-people friendships and people-to-people diplomacies, so that foreign countries understand who Indian women were and what their strengths were, what their needs were. She said women all over the world had similar circumstances, similar problems, and they must learn to understand each other to forge strength. In 1932, with a group of Indian women based in London at the time, including Sarojini Naidu, she attended the International Alliance of Women for Suffrage and Equal Citizenship in Berlin, leading the Indian delegation at the behest of Naidu. She was elected to the board of Alliance for several years. She continued to work for the Alliance and writes in her memoirs that the meetings gave her first-hand experience of dealing with international work for women's rights. About the importance of this international exposure, she was to write later. Our delegates have gained considerable valuable experience in methods of work and considerably widened their knowledge of the countries they have visited. It also enlarged her own vision and understanding of the world. In 1946, she was to write, "We are today on the threshold of a new era. there is a consciousness in the world of spiritual, moral, political forces that must be harnessed to establish international justice and goodwill, which alone can ensure world peace. In the setting up of institutions like UNESCO and UN, and in efforts to encourage cultural understanding. It is of great pride that when she became the president of All India Women's Conference, she received personal letters from Sunyat Sen, that is the father of the Chinese Revolution, from illustrious people from all over the world who sent personal letters to her, including Dr. Radhakrishnan, Pandit Nehru, and many of the freedom fighters, to congratulate her on becoming president of such a prestigious organization. She received letters of message from America, from England, from other organizations, saying that they were wanting to have liaison and friendships with the All India Women's Conference and create some kind of a synergy and work together. So this is a matter of great pride that the prestige of the president of the All India Women's Conference has such international stature. This is a photograph of her in 1930 in London. Dhanwanthi had a strong belief in the autonomy of Indian women, which perhaps shaped much of her work. Perhaps the best example of this lies in her short speech at the Conference of Indian Social Evils, organized by the famed member of the British Parliament, Eleanor Rathbone. While invited to attend the conference, she found it absurd that she, as an Indian woman, was not given a platform to speak, despite the fact that the conference was about her country and women like herself. Next, she wrote in her memoir, I was asked for permission to speak. I asked for permission to speak and was graciously allowed 5 minutes. I did not speak on any of the subjects on the agenda, but merely disputed the right of British women to arrange a conference on Indian social evils in London when speakers were British and many of them had never even visited India. When Sir Rama was posted to Durban in South Africa, Dhanwanthi started the Indian Women's Association in Durban and worked hard for the betterment of the Indian community and received the name Human Dynamo. However, the British government kept a very strict watch on the activities of the wives of the ICS officers who were considered the steel frame of India. Here is a picture of her and Sir Rama Rao with our first president, Dr. Radhakrishnan, in Durban, South Africa in 1938. She used all the privileges that she had in being the wife of an ICS officer, not to just have a good life, but to use all those connections and plunge it back into society and the upliftment of women and children. In 1941, Dhanwanthi settled back in Bombay, where she busied herself with women's organizations in the country. Meanwhile, she was perturbed by the neglect and the dire conditions she saw in the slums. Situations like Bengal famine and others in 1943, and she noted how despite increasing economic gaps and poverty, people continued to reproduce well beyond their means. Remember, she herself was one of 9 children. She traveled the country widely as a member of the AIWC. These impressions remained with her. Later, she said, we have created 200 centers in both provinces and Indian states, and we have attracted 30,000 women as members to take active interest in questions that affect them and their country, and to express themselves fearlessly, and to work in cooperation for ideals that must be common to all over the women all over the world. She was very concerned about the problem of women who were victims of frequent childbirth, as well as the problem of population explosion. She courageously went ahead against the prevailing political opinion. In fact, she clashed with Mahatma Gandhi by insisting that family planning was the need of the hour. This was not something that Gandhiji approved of. And in fact, many of the leaders of that time thought this a very revolutionary and novel concept. She recalled, when I thought over those glimpses of slum life, it became clear to me that however much our social workers tried to improve conditions, nothing could be accomplished while unlimited number of children continued to be born in crowded houses where expansion was impossible. Dhanwanthi and the Family Planning Association drew upon the All India Women's Conference's long-standing argument that family planning was a woman's issue. Here is a picture of the first All India Family Planning Conference in 1951. Next slide. In 1949, she founded the Family Planning Association of India, which soon became the country's largest. Ritu, can you show the next slide? Which soon became the country's largest non-governmental organization working in the field of population control. Ritu, can you show the next slide? In this, she strengthened to fight ignorance and superstition strengthened by Mahatma Gandhi's aversion to artificial conception. Ritu, can you show us the next slide? Echoing renowned birth control activist Margaret Sanger's sentiments, she believed that women should bear only the children that they wanted. Meanwhile, her repeated insistence that voluntary organizations must play an essential role in bringing family planning to ordinary people further solidified the mediating role of the Family Planning Association, the AIWC, and their cadre of middle-class women volunteers. Dhanwanthi Rama Rao was very clear in her vision. At the time when she became the president of AIWC, she put forward the points very clearly. She even advocated for a ministry of social justice. She talked about how women must form core committees in alliance with whatever the national agenda was, to see that at the grassroots level, those ideals that the leaders, the political leaders were trying to make the architecture of a modern India could be translated. And the role of AIWC was to be an adjunct to the government of the time, to be a parallel force that would translate all the policies of the government into action at the grassroots level. This became the mantra of the All India Women's Conference, nation building. India became the first country to launch a nationwide family planning program. Initially, its aim was mainly birth control, and it later expanded to include mother and child health, nutrition, and family welfare in its ambit. In 1952, she organized in India the International Planned Parenthood Conference, which resulted in the formation of the IPPF. She was honorary president of this organization. You can see from the next slide, Ritu, can you show that? How they took this campaign to villages. You can see that car, I think it's a Bentley or a Rolls, I don't know, but it's going into villages and they are bringing this concept and they are being greeted as if they are bringing something new into those. Dhanwanthi Rama Rao always said India lives in her villages. Until the women in the villages learn, in fact, she took a great interest in recipes. She found that the food eaten by eating coarse grain, this thing that today we are learning, that eat brown rice and eat red rice and eat the local food, she would again and again say that that was the nutritious food, and we must teach our women the nutritional value of the diet and the products and produce that are around and found locally. There was not in any aspect of life that she didn't take interest in. And she went toward India, north, south, east, west, carrying these ideas like a missionary into the heart of villages where she said change would come. In the aftermath of independence, both the Family Planning Association and AIWC suggested that family planning could serve as a national response to the women's question by linking women's development to the nation. Recognizing a growing concern about population, the leaders, this is what they decided. Thanks to Dhanwanthi's efforts, India's first 5-year plan included family planning as a very important component. You can see from the next photograph with Margaret Sanger and other leaders of international repute that she constantly networked with international organizations trying to bring to India their expertise and trying to show them our needs. The next one was with Mrs. Mary Lasker. Mrs. Mary Lasker was the liaison agent of all the British organizations. She was the representative, and she personally attended her inauguration, and was a personal friend. Dhanwanthi also studied the problem of trafficking of women and children. Her main focus was illiterate rural women plagued by ill health, the burden of childbirth, and having an authoritative male partner, thus having no decision making in your own life. In 1955, she was elected chairman of the Social and Moral Hygiene Inquiry Committee. There's a photograph of her with Adlai Stevenson in 1955. And then there's a next one with Madam Sunyat Sen. Madam Sunyat Sen was the mother-in-law of Chiang Kai-shek, and he was the first person to lead the Communist Revolution in China. And there's another one with Mao Zedong in 1958. I'm showing you these photographs so that you can understand the reach and power and also the vision of those early pioneers of the All India Women's Conference who rose to the helm. Finally, the Prime Minister Pandit Nehru admired her work, and she was given the Padma Bhushan. There's a slide showing him pinning the Padma Bhushan on her, and also a list of the awards. In 1938, she was given the Kaisar-e-Hind Medal by King George V in London. In 59, that is about 20 years later, she got the Padma Bhushan Award. In 1961, the Vatarmul Award for Family Planning Leadership. In 1999, the Family of Man Award. And then in 1965, the Albert Mary Lasker Award for Planned Parenthood Meeting. There's a picture that you can see next, Ritu, of Dr. Rajendra Prasad, the President of India, conferring the Padma Bhushan on her in 1959. And here ends my presentation with the picture of her two surviving sisters, Bishan and Kamala. She was the only one who was able to break the shackles and lead this very powerful and interesting life. And though her sisters were educated, they were not able to do as much as her, but that did not take her away from her family. She always remained very closely connected to her family, found time for them, found time, as I said in the beginning, to get involved with the weddings and all other festivities of her nieces and grandnieces, etc. In her later years, she spent her time in the company of her daughters' families and her sisters, and breathed her last in Mumbai at the age of 94, Mumbai that she loved, in 1987. And with her family of grandchildren, Asha Wagle, who was the first woman to run an investment firm, an investment banker in London, Nikhil Wagle, her grandson, Nina Wagle Marx, who runs the Marx Foundation in America, and Jay Peter Bowers. Thank you very much for giving me this opportunity. I'm sorry if I've overstepped my time.
Oh, no, that was amazing, Manju. Thank you so much. It was, we were all ears and we didn't know when the time passed. You beautifully pointed out the life and how you knit the whole thing. Indeed, a human dynamo, as you said. Oh, it was amazing. And I just wish we could go on, hearing more about this and her work. And most impressive was, how she began with all the struggle that usually most of the women had to do. That struggle was part of everyone's life. And then coming to the family planning activities against all odds. This is what the AIWC women are all about in their struggles. I think we cannot have enough of this talk ever, but now we have to move on to our next, and we are again eager to hear about from our next speaker, Mrs. Neena Puri. We welcome you, ma'am. You are going to talk about in your own way, a tribute to Lady Dhanwanthi Rama Rao. Mrs. Neena Puri was the international president of IPPF. She was the national president of the FPAI, the Family Planning Association of India, and the International Planned Parenthood Federation. Now, she's presently the patron of FPAI and has been a member of the governing bodies and the executive committees of several organizations in the country and outside the country, like the Ministry of Health and Family Welfare. She was in the steering committee on population education, in the open school, National Open School, FICCI, CII, All India Child Welfare Council, Red Cross Society, and so on, goes on. You have been an active volunteer in the field of social work for more than 5.5 decades, since the age of 22 years. And your special focus is on women's development and empowerment issues. Since 1973, you have been actively working in the sphere of family planning, including the reproductive rights of women's health and child health services. One of the subjects very close to Lady Rao's heart also. That's how, I mean, we can imagine that you inherited her work also in a way and carried it forth. We welcome you, ma'am. It's a pleasure and a proud moment for us that you have come all the way and joined us today. I think because of Wi-Fi problems, you had to come to Delhi. Thank you so much. Over to you, Mrs. Neena.
Thank you, Yutika, for your introduction. Perhaps not necessary, but after Manju, it's a hard act to follow with a 360-degree kaleidoscopic vision of what Dhanwanthi Vamara was. I will be much shorter, because she's encapsulated everything so beautifully. But there are some impressions that I have and associations which I would like to share. I begin by saying, respected President Sheila Kakade and members of the All India Women's Conference, I deem it a great honor and privilege to be invited to share a few moments of reminiscence about Lady Rama Rao, a torchbearer for women's emancipation in various spheres of life, as many before me have articulated. However, the focus for me is her dedication and her devotion in the field of family planning and women's reproductive health, working in the true spirit of voluntarism. The lady had a true touch of class, graceful and elegant, with a winning personality. I recall I was speaking on the platform of the Punjab and Haryana PhD chamber when they every year presented population awards, and they'd asked me to say a few words. And there I mentioned the name of Lady Rama Rao as the pioneer of family planning and introducing it. After I'd said my piece, we came down and we were having tea. Somebody beckoned me. Lady Rama Rao, yaad aa gayi aapko? That, you know, she had been forgotten as far as family planning was concerned. But I mentioned her because I believed in her. And I mean, it's not that she was forgotten. My era started with Mrs. Ramabai Wadya. So the man was caustic, hurt, and was very happy that I had brought her. And therefore, it gives me even more pleasure that you've asked me to share my little association and the work she did in the field of family planning. She was a rebel with a cause, with courage, conviction, and fortitude, entered uncharted waters, truly revolutionary in the 1930s and 40s, related to family planning and sexual reproductive health. In fact, she created a revolution of sorts, dealing with the very personal and private life of couples, which entailed the idea of contraception that would act as a double-edged sword to curtail the fast-growing population and at the same time save women's lives, burdened with childbearing constantly, endangering their own life and the and these were the issues that she really planted as a stream of focus of work that was her baby in a sense. I would also like to narrate that my father was posted in the embassy in Washington, and we were very close to the BK Nehrus. and I think it was 1961 or 62. My mother was a doctor, and she had a lot of kinship with my mother, and sometimes we went there for tea or something. And I also went along. And somebody came down the steps, which has been articulated so well by Manju, was this gracious, elegant lady coming down the steps, Lady Rama Rao. And, you know, I was just bewitched looking at her with the kind of grace and the kind of decor and the kind of poise this lady had. And I was in awe. But when we sat down, maybe for a few minutes, her gentleness and her communication, I could understand that her inner core was a feeling of equality and the question of gender issues and the whole idea of humanity and the question of basically talking not down but with people anywhere, which was a rarity of a person of her stature. I would also like to just create some sort of capsules about her as far as her persona was concerned. I was involved from, as was mentioned, from 73. But my mother gave her position so that younger people, I was only 28 or something. So I, at that age, got into the pipeline of the bureaucracy or hierarchy of the Family Planning Association of India. And at that time, in the early days, Mrs. Lady Rama Rao had rolled over and was the patron. And Mrs. Wadia became, in 1963, the president of the Family Planning Association of India. And at that time, these ladies, we would be on stage and we would be looking in awe of Avabai Wadia and Lady Rama Rao as, you know, such stately figures, you know, and both of them wore the same brooch, the same coiffured hair, the same silk saris, and the same grace. But at the same time, we were a little scared of them also at that time. That if we spoke anything, you know, it was better not to speak to say, and when we come down. So it was more at that time with Mrs. Wadia, but Lady Rama was, I only saw a glimpse of her a couple of times. But as I said, you know, her whole persona doesn't leave you. And then that whole history of hers, from hardship to kingship that she was beholden with. I would also like to now tell you something about, as was mentioned, the establishment of the Family Planning Association in 1949, which was a pioneering in a very challenging area to address issues in women's health. And we were talking about not only population control or stabilization, but also in saving, which was the women's concern, about them having so many children and saving lives of mothers and their newborn children. But it took on to some extent. But what people were really thinking about was more about infertility, people who were not having children. That sort of took over from population control to. So this was well understood as the other side of the coin, and therefore was introduced. And in the early years, Dr. Pillai started the first infertility clinic in Bombay in those days. So it was both sides that we adhered to, because that was humanity. It isn't just, you know, controlling population, but there were so many people, so much data that so many women and men were not having children, and with a little bit of intervention, which was medical, many of them could conceive. Both sides of the coin were addressed. Then, as Manju mentioned, linking family planning with maternity and child welfare and work in all government centers, primary clinics in rural areas to maternity departments, city hospitals, family planning was a major component everywhere. And then on top of that, as far as the Family Planning Association was concerned, we were involved as a voluntary organization, especially in the educational and communicational work in family planning, and also innovative projects which the government had a one-stick policy where we were able to experiment with schemes outside the main agenda of the government. And with certain things that were addressed by Manju as far as big vans and buses and cars going into the rural areas as far as introducing family planning. In 1954, Lady Rama Rao took a lecture tour in America, where she visited 36 cities and addressed the social issues and family planning. But as far as America was concerned, she was given a hostile welcome as far as the family planning component was concerned. Because there was I have faced it myself, being in later years, the same issues of opposition because of the Catholics, as far as contraception is concerned. So that particular tour to 36 cities landed up as a damn squib because she could not really achieve very well. But at this time, I would also like to say, along with Lady Rama Rao, there were stalwarts, other who all sort of contributed to the mainstream of women's development, like Rajkumari Amrit Kaur, who was a health minister, although she was against family planning, but because of her Christian upbringing. And there was Durga Das Deshmukh, Kamla Devi Chattopadhyay, Raksha, Saran, Sarojini Naidu, Vijay Lakshmi Pandit, and a host of stalwarts, all on this microcosm of social work of women, which was, and they got their strength, I think, from the approval of such, revered persons like Pandit Nehru, Radhakrishnan, and they were that society, and yet a sensitive society, which helped women in promoting causes for other women. So this was a good harmony that was happening, which certainly I can tell you is not there anymore. In IPPF in 1959, there was an international conference, and the chief guest was Panditji. And Margaret Sanger has been the pioneer suffragette leader who was ailing and sick. But she visited after stopping about 6 places: Hawaii, Hong Kong, Singapore, Calcutta, then landed in Delhi. And she wanted to attend this conference in 1959. And I can imagine, her interest in it because it was Panditji who was going to inaugurate the conference. Lady Rama Rao mentioned to Panditji that she's not very well, but Margaret Sanger is she here? Is she here? So when she got dressed, she came. He picked her by the arm, took her to the stage, and the kind of man he was. And this woman must have gone by the, I met a movie star or something. She was so happy. She was so sick, but I'm sure this was a bee in her bonnet. And she worked for it because she knew that Panditji was. I can tell you in London in 1950, when my father was posted, and Panditji had come there, and Krishna Menon was the High Commissioner. And somehow I was a little child, I was 6. Went and he shook my hand and held my hand, Panditji. for 7 days I didn't wash my hands because that was the kind of reverence that you had for people. So in between you get these. Now there's another issue which was very tickling at that time. Now it is even, and I have faced it myself terribly. Question of abortion, and this is a question where in India, at least, we took a leaf from the Japanese who had officially taken on abortion as a program, but nobody else, anywhere else, would allow it. Certainly not in the time of Gandhiji or any of this. So abortion, because we were losing women, because most of these abortions were done in villages with sticks and stones and all the rest, and women were dying. So that it was a very much part of the whole existence of a program if it didn't carry this particular activity. And therefore, in 1971, the Medical Termination of Pregnancy Act was enacted. And mind you, India has been very liberal because I know the gag rule in the United States, which happened during Mrs. Wadia's time and later in my time, was that the entire funding of IPPF was completely stopped if any country engaged in abortion equity. So India suffered, but it stood for it. And we stood by it when doors closed, windows opened, and other agencies, IPPF being the main funder, helped us. But we stood by our convictions because it was needed. It was a nice thing, but women were dying and doing abortion. So legal abortions came into the country after 1971, but it was a very hard issue to introduce. The other issue that I'm sure when Lady Rama Rao, in her knowledge and her width of education and consideration, would definitely have focused on was young people. Because young people are 65% of India's population. And if we do not introduce issues and information on family planning, and today with the mobile and all kinds of information, the problem is getting wrong information. Information, communication, training of workers in family planning are issues that and programs that we are now at the moment very much engaged in focus and getting young people on our governance boards now. So the whole, you have to flow with the stream and the times. And therefore we have to adapt and adjust. So programs are accordingly tailored to the needs of the times. And that is something I'm sure Lady Rama Rao would herself have engaged in because she was such an open-minded, liberal lady and strong. I would also like to say that Lady Rama Rao and both Mrs. Wadia were proud of their Indianness, always beautifully, immaculately dressed in the most gorgeous saris, as has been mentioned, with a flow of grace in temperament and words articulated and yet staunchly firm in what they believed in. As Mrs. Wadia shared with me in the initial years, women like Lady Rama Rao herself and many others selflessly gave of space and other furniture, furnishings to begin their work for those who were less privileged. In fact, Lady Rama Rao's husband, as I mentioned, gave her his room in his office where the Family Planning Association was started. But when the organization grew, we had to find another place. And for that, you needed money. So the Watermole Foundation and JRD Tata were the trigger because money makes the mayor go. And without that, we couldn't have done anything. So they were the ones who helped us initiate and trigger and furnish and pay the rent for shifting from the Benical house. I would also like to not sort of mention, volunteers of yesteryear, yes, but in the Family Planning Association now, we still have presently dedicated volunteers, and some of these names must be very familiar to you and are on the international horizon. Dr. Sunewala, Dr. Vasa, who just passed away as a sexologist. He was with that movie, Badhai or something, which deals with contraception and all. He was a wonderful man, just died. So very well-known sexologist, Dr. Ucha Krishna, a well-known gynecologist. Today, Dr. Noza Sharia, are names all over the Indian circuit and the international circuit as far as the closest advisors to the family planning and many more volunteers and staff in our 40 branches approximately and various projects that are going on at the moment in the country. So towards the end, I would just like to say the seed that Lady Rama Rao planted was nurtured with verve and gusto by Avabai Vadia from 1963 and has grown into one of the most respected and the largest country organizations in the sphere of family planning, reproductive rights, and the health and welfare of women and children in India. Today, our dedicated volunteers and staff members are two wheels of a chariot, doing yeoman service through its approximately 40 branches and projects throughout the country. Funds are obtained largely through IPPF and the national and state governments, along with other international organizations. And yet, I think I missed this out, but in 1974, the Silver Jubilee year of FPI, Lady Dhanwanthi Rama Rao was presented an inscribed silver plaque which she cherished, and she writes in the book in Inheritance that was one of her revered possessions that she cherished all her life. And
that is so interesting.
So this Vadia and Mrs. Rama Rao, that is the culture we are trying at the moment to perpetuate in our organization. But I have to admit that the spirit lit the flames of glowing candle of volunteerism, so very evident in selfless work, seems to be ebbing away, as I have observed. Over time, we have to respect change and at the same time appreciate the many paths lit by so many stalwarts of meaningful ideas, and one of them was certainly family planning, pressing the issues of population stabilization, and more importantly, saving women's lives, who have been weighed down under the weight of bearing numerous children, resulting in maternal mortality and child mortality. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much. Thank you, Neena ji. That was amazing. Lest we forget, you rightly said her role, Lady Rama Rao's role in family planning, not just family planning, the intricacies of it all you brought out. That was so interesting. Till the culmination of the MTP Act, medical termination of pregnancy and all, so relevant even today and taking new shapes and changes. So amazing. Thank you so much for your input today. We move on with the program, and the final item today is a video interview with a family in America, with her granddaughter, Noah Bagley Marks, and granddaughter-in-law, Ayadi Bagley. This is a recording done by Manjuji, our own MIC and ex-treasurer, Dr. Manju Kak has done this. I'm going to share the screen with you, and maybe if you are able to see, just let me know. Can you see the?
Yes.
And now
Yutika ji, yes, carry on.
Yes.
So shall we begin? Yes, let's begin.
Yes, please.
Okay. So Nina, nice to meet you, even though we are all in virtual space, but it's a good connect because we are related distantly, but
yeah, I think, were you able to hear that, Sheila ji?
Yeah, we could hear, but then it stopped.
Yeah, there was a glitch. It said, let me see.
You share again.
Hmm. No.
No. Network error.
नहीं, मेरा नेटवर्क है, ये नहीं चल रहा.
Passcode, you have to put the passcode. That question mark and that passcode is there, na?
myself like this.
Yes.
Decades.
Okay, now it's fine.
How is she better known as? I thought I would just like to know a little bit more about when you were growing up. Did you know that she was this very special person? Were you aware of that? And if you were aware, what kind of an impression or influence did it make on your life or shape your own childhood?
Well, first of all, it's wonderful to meet you, even in this virtual space, as you say, Manju, and Mary Jane and I, who have sort of lived side by side over many decades, have talked about how grateful we are to you and to all of your colleagues for honoring our grandmother, my grandmother, our grandmother. Our whole family cherishes her life and legacy, and it's really a privilege for us to share some memories with you and with all the others who will hear this tribute. So, you know, my grandmother was, from the first moment you met her, a memorable person. She was granny to us, to our spouses, to her great-grandchildren, and to everyone's friends. I think she was Lady Rama for about 2 minutes with my friends. Mary Jane will remember, before she was like, oh, call me granny. And so they all did.
Yeah.
Even as a child, I knew she was extraordinary. She had this immediate impact on just about everybody she met. And what I think Mary Jane and I would agree, what stood out about that was her positivity and her curiosity. She was interested in everyone. She talked to our large extended family, as you know, Manju. She had friends of all ages around India and the world. She made friends with orphans and taxi drivers and flight attendants and famous people, and always with the same kind of humor and warmth. She deeply believed, and as I grew up, I began to realize how significant this was, that we must find ways to help the powerless be heard. In India, she focused on women, especially, of course, on mothers and daughters who were too often, she felt, burdened with responsibilities without the appropriate autonomy and respect. And in her book, and in many conversations with me, she described the influence of her mother, with whom, as the youngest daughter, she was at home until she married late in those days at 26. She had a uniquely close relationship, I think. And I think her focus on maternal and infant health, on family planning, more broadly on women's rights, grew from observing her mother and their family life. So I wanted to say a couple of words about our great-grandmother, who did not live a public life. She was extraordinary as well. She was either pregnant or nursing for 25 years from the age of 18 to 43. She bore 12 children, 9 of whom survived. Through many challenges, she learned to focus on core values and goals, and like Granny, to find unlikely allies. So one of my favorite unlikely allies, and this is described in Granny's book, was a Catholic priest who worked in an excellent girls' school. And my great-grandmother had determined that education was the essential game changer. That was the core value she shared with that Jesuit, and she enrolled her girls in that school. The lesson was, keep your eye on the goal. Find people to help you, but keep your eye on the goal. Her integrity and her humility also, I think, really influenced Granny. Her mother acknowledged her own misjudgments and mistakes, and Granny learned those lessons well. There was gossip when she herself went to college, when she went to graduate school, when she married outside the Kashmiri community, and her family stood with her. And then, as Mary Jane and I often note, she used her public life as a platform to draw attention to issues and to causes that she cared deeply about. I remember talking with her about a meeting that had not gone well. I think she was with her wonderful friend Avabai Wadia and all those other stalwart women, and they were not received particularly respectfully. And she said, remember Gandhi said, if you're right and you know it, speak your mind. Even if you're a minority of one, the truth is still the truth. And that's what
That's nice.
That's what we carry with us.
Okay. That was very nice, a very nice recollection. And it kind of brought her to life. And it's interesting that you, as a granddaughter, were observant enough to see these nuances in her life and as well as in her persona. But coming to you, Mary Jane, you came to Bombay as a young woman and you met Nikki's grandmother. So what impression did she make on you and what did you take away because you left shortly and went back to America? And later on, very fortuitously or coincidentally, you started working for the IPPF, which is an organization that she piloted in India. So did she influence you in that choice, or was it just something that happened along the road? I'd like to hear something.
I really count it as one of the great gifts of my life that Nina invited me to India in the summer of 1970. We were roommates at college at that time. And I met her entire family, including my future husband, Nikki, but also just as importantly, Granny. We all call her Granny, as Nina has said. When I met her, she was 77 years young, and she was young.
Yes.
6 years older than I am now, right now. And she had such life, such warmth, such vibrance, and such feistiness too. She was incredibly welcoming to me, which was lovely. Wherever she was with other people, she held court. So she would tell passionate and spellbinding stories about her family, about women's advancement in India, about some person she'd met just the other day. Tea with Granny, which she had every single afternoon of her life, was usually with a parade of visitors every day, and it was an occasion. She was still active at that time. The International Planned Parenthood Federation, she used to go every year for 2 years until she was nearly 80, I think. She used to go twice a year. And she was an irresistible combination of curiosity, as Nina said, charm, and passionate conviction about what was important and what was right. Nobody left her presence without feeling cared about, and at the same time, drawn into the issues that she talked about and believing that they too should become active in those issues. She was so persuasive and so charming. I was so lucky to get to spend many years close to Granny, both when I was in India and later when I moved to the United States. Nikki and I had lived with her in her flat in Seaface Park now in Mumbai in the early 70s for about a year or two. So I had the pleasure of learning how to keep house in India from Granny, which was great fun. I never learned to cook the way she did. She was amazing. And then when we moved to Los Angeles in 1977 with our two young daughters at the time, she came to stay with us for a few months at first, and then later for about 2.5 years there, here. I say she came to stay with us, but if I'm honest, she really came to stay with her great grandchildren, my 3 daughters and Nina's children, most importantly. And then, of course, her beloved grandson and granddaughter, Nikki and Nina. She was absolutely my link to Planned Parenthood here in Los Angeles. When she first came to stay with us, we lived literally right next door to a woman named Anne Petroni, who was on the board of Planned Parenthood Los Angeles. So, of course, Anne wanted to meet Granny, who was by then 84 years old. And Anne immediately arranged for Granny to address a public meeting with hundreds of supporters of Planned Parenthood, including the then president of the National Federation of Planned Parenthood, the amazing Faye Waddleton. I don't know if you've heard of her, but she was a phenomenal woman too. Granny just wowed the crowd with her usual combination of warmth, charm, passion, and an exhortation to get involved, learn more, and do more. Because that was so typical of Granny. She had learned over years of addressing audiences that knew very little about India and were invariably rather paternalistic about what they thought India needed. That a combination of charm, powerful stories, and her own evident passion would win people over to care about what she cared about, and to learn that Indian women had what it took to address their own issues. They just needed everyone's moral and financial support. I wasn't hard myself personally to convince about women's rights. We cared about that in my family as well. And I went on to become a volunteer at Planned Parenthood, and then a board member, and then eventually the executive director here in Los Angeles. And ultimately, I ran the international programs of the American Planned Parenthood organization for a year. When I was, I guess, 60. So I really feel like I'm in Granny's mode, and that I just keep doing this year after year after year because I keep caring about it. But what I took from Granny, honestly, was that real human warmth, passion, and fearlessness about standing up for what's right. And that is what wins people over. We all need to, sort of gather a little bit of that spirit as we're moving in this world.
Yeah, well, it's very interesting what you said, and what strikes a sort of a note in my mind, or a chord in my mind, is when you said that she made people care passionately about the things she cared about just by the fact that she was so vibrant and probably warm. And so she exuded that kind of enthusiasm to them. And
Yes.
that's a very rare quality.
Yes.
And probably the quality of a leader.
Yes,
Well,
absolutely.
yes. Well, coming back to you, Nina.
Yutika, unmute. Yutika, unmute yourself. We don't have sound.
This avatar of yours now, in your second career, so to speak, is some part of it a legacy of your grandmother?
Oh, absolutely. It's so interesting listening to Mary Jane, that it's often when we look back and reflect that we see how influential somebody important in our life is in the time and the moment. You're just living the relationship, and then you look back and you think, oh my goodness, there were all these extraordinary moments of impact. And I talk to students, having done this now for over 40 years, I talk to students a lot about points of impact. When something strikes you, stop and pay attention to why that actually made a difference. It probably speaks to something that you care about, whether you agree or you disagree. It's so important to care. And I think that was, as Mary Jane said, that was one of her founding values for us. You don't get not to care. You earn your space here. You earn this life, and you need to make the most of it. Are you going to make mistakes? Of course you are. We all make mistakes. Are people going to dislike you? Of course they are. But that's okay, right? And so what I realized, I was thinking about how she influenced me. Of course, she influenced my teaching. I studied English as she did. When I graduated from Harvard, here is the medal she gave me that she won in 1917 at the University of Madras. So she gave me, isn't that special? It's wonderful. It says Dhanwanthi Handu on it, her maiden name. Yes. The University of Madras. And I taught as she did. And then I sort of found my own broader focus, moving into what we call in this country college counseling or college advising, helping young people find their way through higher education. The same principle, one size doesn't fit all, but one size doesn't have to fit all. You don't have to be like your siblings or your cousins or your friends, or the people you dislike, but you must find your way. That you cannot outsource. So for over 30 years, I worked primarily in girls' schools, and then I founded Marcus Education, the company that I now run. Our counselors and our tutors provide educational advice and support for students and families around the country and the world, including many in India, helping them get to higher education and beyond. Granny would be very proud that my daughter gave up practicing law to come and run our graduate program. So she's very involved in what we do and is actually taking over the company as I step back, which is another nice piece of legacy. And then with Jonathan, my wonderful husband now of almost 50 years, I also founded Collegiate Directions, Inc. We call it CDI, which is an education-focused nonprofit. Our CDI team works with over 3,000 students in under-resourced schools, yes, low-income students a year, in under-resourced public schools where they don't have the facilities or sometimes the faculty to really support kids who need help in so many ways. And we help them, including immigrants from India and around the world, to get the mentoring and the support that they need to get to and through college, to start a career, to find a life, and to find ways to mentor and support others. Service is an essential component of that program, because we believe that you have to live paying it forward. You have to give it back. You have to look forward and you have to look back. And Jonathan, my husband, was also, interestingly, deeply, like Mary Jane, influenced by Granny. In fact, she joked that she brought us together. Before I ever knew him, he was in the American Peace Corps in India. And he was his first year a volunteer in a little village near Pune. And the second year, he worked in the family planning section of the Peace Corps in her office. So he saw her every day. And got to know her and my family before I came. I was at school in England and doing things in England before I ever met him. He's a mediator and an arbitrator, but he still maintains an interest in Planned Parenthood. And that is, I think we're all part of this, this legacy and this history that you have to stand together. So in many ways, I think Granny's life continues to inspire generations of our family beyond even people who didn't know her, right? Who didn't actually meet her. Because there's a there's a story in her story.
Yes.
About how you find yourself and you make yourself. And I thought I'd just mention something that makes me think of her almost every day. Jonathan we were married almost 50 years ago, I said, and the day before we were married, he took a photograph of Granny sitting outside the room in my parents' house where we were actually married. And she's sitting between her two older sisters. So they were in their late 70s, yes, well into their 80s at the time, Kamla and Bishan. And they are sitting tightly knit. So you couldn't slide a ruler between them, shoulder to shoulder. Yes. They sit and they look at the camera, each in their individual way, with this confidence and this optimism that is, I think, really remarkable for their generation, for their age, and for the difference in their lives. So, you know, they lived very long and very different lives, but one of the gifts that amazing great-grandmother, their mother, gave them was that bonds are unbreakable. And
that's beautiful.
For me, they embody the support that we as family members, as women, as friends, as women, can and must give each other, and the difference we can make when we stand together, right? And I just want to thank you again for honoring Granny, and most importantly, actually, for the incredibly important, life-changing work all of you do. This is a movement, this is a cause, and it's very far from over. There's so much more to be done.
Absolutely, absolutely.
Thank you.
Well, that was a very moving tribute, Nina. And you're right, our organization, the All India Women's Conference, founded in 1927 by Margaret Cousins, continues, and we are celebrating our presidents who have given so much to the organization and to India, such as your grandmother. So we are very lucky to have you people with us to share this moment. And as you said very rightly, that caring is not an option. Or rather, not caring is not an option. It's something that you learn. Service, you have to give back. And that is a beautiful sentiment. So can I ask you the last question, Mary Jane? And that is, you know, as an American, married into this household, having children who had been in contact with her, with the Granny, as you called her, you have already shared with me your legacy from her. But what of this would you like to pass down to your children, who are, after all, half Indian, half American? They have not known her, so to speak, and known of her work in India. But what would you like to pass down to them, because you knew her and you knew of her work?
You know, my children are very lucky because they did know her. They knew her for some time. My grandchildren didn't know her, but I hope that you know, we tell stories about her all the time, and I really want them to know how lucky they are to have her genes coursing in their bodies. I think my children and I all remember that Granny was passionate and charming and warm, and at the same time fearless and very stubborn. All of those qualities made her the success that she was. And of course, we all love that she was a champion of women. My ex-husband, Nikki, and I have 3 beautiful daughters, and my daughters and I are committed and passionate about women's rights. And we all take inspiration from Granny, as I know you and all of your members do as well. Nina's been eloquent about how her mother was really the fount of her sense of justice for women that propelled so much of what she did. One of my favorite stories about Granny's life, which is also actually in her book, but I heard it as a story also through my life was her indignant insistence on respect for India and India's women when she was in England in 1929 and for a few years thereafter. So you just told me the All India Women's Conference started in 1927. She was clearly already a powerful advocate for that work.
Yes, absolutely.
So she was in her mid-30s when she first went to London. She had never been out of the country before, but she went there because her husband had been posted there to write the Simon Commission report with recommendations for how Britain should address the situation in India. So she was there, and along with 3 other Indian women who were in London at the same time, she learned of a conference that was going to be happening about Indian social evils that was organized by Margaret Rathbone, a member of Parliament, just as Parliament was beginning to consider its policy regarding India. So Granny and her 3 Indian women friends offered to help with the conference, but they were ignored. And in the end, all of the speakers were British. Margaret Rathbone, the parliamentarian, was the sponsor, and she had written a pamphlet decrying the Indian social evils that she said Britain should remedy, potentially influencing the decision that Parliament would be making regarding India. Granny and her colleagues were horrified as they listened to the proceedings. And so, of course, it was Granny, age 36, with no prior experience living, much less speaking abroad, who decided she had to stand up and speak to this august crowd. And she did, protesting that none of the women speaking in the conference had ever been to India, that she and her friends had offered to help and had been ignored, that Indian women had for years been working on the issues that mattered in India, and that British women with no experience could not possibly understand how to address social conditions in India. Imagine this amazing young woman.
That was, really what you call a tour de force.
Right. 2 of the most prominent women there, both British suffragettes, Sylvia Pankhurst and Mrs. Emmeline Pettit-Lawrence, supported her and insisted against the objections of Margaret Rathbone that she be allowed to speak longer and again the next day. Of course, she was powerfully convincing and warmly received. And from there, she was invited all across Britain to speak to and educate British women about the situation in India, about the efforts of Indian women, and about how British women could support rather than supplant Indian women's efforts. And this was something that Granny still talked about, not necessarily that conference, but this idea that what in the United States and Britain and so on need to do is support the work of women who are there on the ground, who know what needs to be done. And that was something that really influenced me and influenced my children as well. That is so typically Granny, and that courage and fearlessness sparked by indignation inspires me and my daughters, and I hope will inspire my grandchildren every day. It's she was so extraordinary. I was looking at a picture of her from the year when Nina and I were both married. And the other thing that you just couldn't help but love was her amazing sense of humor. When she laughed, it was like the sun was shining everywhere. It was amazing. I've had so much fun over the last few weeks just thinking about Granny and looking at pictures of her and reviewing. Thank you. Thank you so much for celebrating this remarkable woman and human being. We love her deeply, and we're so glad that she's getting this recognition.
That is a wonderful, wonderful recollection. And I love the fact that you narrated, when she was 36, that sense of indignation as well as of righteousness. Here am I, an Indian from my country, wanting to represent who we are, what we are, and we don't have a voice. And perhaps that's one of the feelings that you get realizing that it is when such indignation comes to the fore, you have change, revolution, and so on and so forth. And as like you all, you have your civil rights movement. So that is cardinal. And I like the fact that you said that is what you want to instill. That is the seed you want to actually implant or wish that your children continue that kind of a legacy in your grandchildren. So I find that a beautiful sentiment. I find it something that it's at the core of the existence of such women. And I'm glad you recollected it and narrated it for our wider audience. So thank you so much, both of you. And I just want to end with something coincidental and also something which is a bit of a memoir. Accidentally, I was going through my letters and one from her, we called her Dhanwanthi because, as you know, my mother died and she was very close to her. So she continued to write us letters. And there's a very beautiful letter which starts off, "My darling Manju, I've heard you've just got engaged to a young man." And then it goes on and it's a long, in those days we had what was called inland letters, which were, longer. And it goes on in that beautiful handwriting of hers. And all these images came back to me. And the second recollection is when I went to Berlin as a board member of the International Alliance of Women, it was coincidental because Dhanwanthi too was the board member of the International Alliance of Women, and she represented India at Berlin. So I found it a very interesting little coincidence. So her legacy lives on through you people mostly, and some of us as well.
No, all of us, Manju, all of us. We stand together.
Yes, and I'm happy that we could do this.
Thank you so much.
And wonderful to have been able to join together for this.
Thank you so much.
Thank you. Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Bye.
That was amazing. We wish this goes on. It was like a story, and I can see everyone.
It's
is so
wonderful, wonderful
crossed.
memories. Wonderful.
सुन के लगता है like we are transported.
Yeah,
Thank you, Dr.
exactly.
Manju. That was too good. And the way, like the legacy that has been carried forward, the commitment, the passion for the cause, all this comes spilling out in this interview. And it was really moving also at times to hear from the grandchildren and the great-grandchildren. And it was so nice. But like every good thing, this also ends. This
Yeah, we
program.
can ask if anyone else also wants to say something.
So we have shown the video. That was the last item.
Yeah. So if anybody.
Any comments? I can see Veena ji, any patrons or anyone, Veena, Jain ji, or anyone.
Some people who have met her in person.
Yeah.
Would be possible.
Neela Vaidya, are you there, Neela Tai?
Yes, I'm there.
Yeah,
And,
yeah. Can you give your memories?
No, I just had a chance to meet her because Avaben had called some of the Bombay branch people, members, to Family Planning Association of India's office in Mumbai. That was Bajaj Bhavan. And she wanted, I was young that time. I had just joined the hostel and MBCC Central Committee. And I was the treasurer of the hostel and secretary of the hostel also for a working women's hostel that time. And two of us were taken by our veterans, Pramoda Ben Gosalia, she was the vice president at Central Office. Sushila Ben Munshi, she was our past president of Mumbai branch. And there Avaben introduced us to Dhanwanthi Rama. As you know, Avaben and Dhanwanthi Ben were all very prestigious personalities, and we were very much impressed by their poise and their dignity and their all aura behind with them. and we were really very awed with their personalities. But they were so gentle and so nice to us. We were just newcomers, and they just put enthusiasm, and with this, all this inspired us very much with their whatever they did for India as a nation, in AIWC as their whatever landmarks they have put in us, and really a very wonderful seminar. Thank you very much, Yuthika ji, our president, and all the participants. And especially thanks to Manjuji Kak. It was so interesting and so inspiring. And thank you very much. And she was a very poised, graceful lady, as everybody mentioned. And we are very proud to be her followers. Thank you very much.
नीलाताई, तुम्ही ओपन करा तुमचा व्हिडिओ. Let everybody see you.
Oh my God.
Yes, they will recognize you.
Why not?
At least
Thank you very much.
Thank you very much for sharing your views. Anyone else?
Will
Yes.
Padmaji say anything?
Yes. Thank you for the thing. And actually, WA is very proud because this great personality, Lady Dhanwanthi Ramarao, started her career here in Madras. She had her higher education and she had her first profession and also started her personal life, got married to her husband in Madras, in Chennai. And she had so many luminaries as mentors. So we are very happy that this great personality started her life here in Chennai and had a good association with WIA. Thank you very much.
I would just like to add.
Yeah, Veena ji, please.
Actually, my mother, Krishna Puri, used to work for the Family Planning Association as a volunteer. And it was in Mumbai that I had met Lady Ramarao. I met Lady Ramarao many times. But the first time when my mother took me to the office, I was perhaps only 12 years old, and she said, you must meet her and greet her, and I was given all the instructions. So I was a bit nervous. So when I first entered,
there's a lot of echo. Yeah.
Saw her. My God, I was absolutely awestruck. There she was, a beautiful woman, a magnificent woman who was so beautifully dressed and wearing her very lovely saris as we mentioned. And for a few minutes, I couldn't say a word. I was so awestruck with her personality. I mean, that's what she was, as we have heard. Even her, in fact, all the lofty ideas and her thoughts and her work was reflected in her face. I mean, in the impression. But after a few minutes of my sitting there, she made me very comfortable. And she asked me, Veena, what would you like to be when you grow up? And at that age, and perhaps even now, I had that ambition. I said, I would like to be a painter. And lo and behold, she opened her drawer and she took out a sketchbook. In it was sketched, she had been doodling faces of some of her colleagues in her own style, which she was brilliant, absolutely, even as an artist. I don't know if anybody knows about this, but while she was in the office, she used to even doodle the sketches. And one of the sketches, of course, had my mother. My mother, who was also a volunteer in the Family Planning Association, And later on, my mother became the president of the Delhi chapter. But she was awesome. And she was so inspiring. I think after that, we all heard many good things about her from her childhood, which have been related. And I must also, I cannot go on and on, but before I conclude, I want to congratulate Sheila Kakre and the management for organizing these webinars because they are very inspiring, and Manju Kaku has done such an excellent job. And of course, it was a pleasure listening to the granddaughters and Nina Puri, who also worked with her and who was also president of FPIA, and Maithili, who gave us such a long, detailed story of the. I'm sorry, there's too much echo. And I want to thank everyone. It was a wonderful webinar, very interesting. Each moment, I think not one moment was dull. I was very impressed. Thank you very much indeed, everyone, all of you. Thank you. Thank you, Supriya. Thank you, Yutika. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Inaji, for that input. Indeed, this is a mesmerizing thing going on, and we don't feel like quitting now. But anyone, any other input, or shall we close the?
Yes, we can close, I think.
Yeah.
No one else is there.
Thank you, everyone. I would, for the formal vote of thanks now, I would like to invite
Yutika,
our
Supriya.
Joint Secretary, AIWC, Srimati Supriya Bhalirao, for the vote of thanks. Supriya, over to you.
Thank you, Yutika. Thank you so much. It was a wonderful, mesmerizing program, as you have already mentioned. This is Supriya Bhalirao, Joint Secretary of AIWC, delivering the formal vote of thanks. Can you all hear me?
Yes.
Yeah. Firstly, I would like to thank Mrs. Sheila Kakde, our president, who has conceived this amazing idea of presenting the past presidents. Today, we have celebrated our 19th president, Lady Dhanwanthi Rama in the 13th session on the past presidents series. I thank Mrs. Kuljit Kaur and our Secretary General and Mrs. Rehana Begum, our Treasurer, for their full support and involvement in this special series of webinars. I would thank all our guest speakers now. Firstly, Mrs. Nina Wagle Marx, granddaughter of Lady Rama Rao, and Mrs. Mary Jane Wagle, the granddaughter-in-law. You are not with us in this meeting today, but I can't thank you both enough for readily agreeing to be with us for this webinar and taking an effort to be in for the video interview with Dr. Manju Kaur. It was nice hearing you both in the interview, and it is nice to know that both of you are carrying forward the legacy of Dhanwanthi ji had set in by involving yourself heavily in the social work up there. Now I thank Dr. Nina Puri. I hope she's still there with us. Dr. Nina Puri, the ex-president of IPPF and former president of